In the late 1800s, the Russian Empire was one of the most powerful nations in Europe, controlling Finland, Ukraine, and much of Poland. To its south was the Ottoman Empire, a comparatively weak and insignificant nation. 3 centuries earlier, that would have seemed unthinkable. In the mid-1500s, the Ottoman Empire dominated much of Eastern Europe and even threatened to take Vienna. At that time, Russia existed only as a small duchy, the Duchy of Moscow. The two states had one thing in common though. Both believed they had a divine mandate to spread their borders and their religion. Conflict was inevitable. The two would go on to have a bitter rivalry that would see 12 wars over 4 centuries. The first arose over the Khanate of Astrakhan, an area north of the Caspian Sea. Astrakhan was important to both nations as it controlled the exit of the Volga River, making it crucial for trade. In 1556, Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible invaded Astrakhan and claimed it for Moscow. He then shut down the slave markets that were essential for the Ottoman Empire. That was not going to be tolerated by the Ottomans. They sent a force to retake Astrakhan, but the campaign was a disaster and their army was crushed. Astrakhan was now firmly under Russian control. In response, the Ottomans and their allies, the Crimean Khanate, invaded Russia the next year. They burned Moscow to the ground and massacred hundreds of thousands. The next clash between the two powers came almost 100 years later. It was over who had influence in the Cossack lands, modern-day Ukraine. At the time, the east was controlled by Moscow, but the west was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. That caused huge resentment in the local population, who hated that the land was divided between two powers. In 1676, Russia invaded and took the capital city of Chigirin. The Ottomans reconquered the city 2 years later, and the war ended as a stalemate. Both sides had achieved little. However, that small war was about to be eclipsed by a much larger conflict, the Great Turkish War. That began in 1683 when the Ottomans laid siege to Vienna. Numerous Christian nations were galvanized to join forces and repel the Muslims from Europe. The Ottomans were pushed back and lost significant territory, including Chigirin. In the north, Russia tried to take the Crimean Khanate, but their attempts failed. Unable to take Crimea, Russian Tsar Peter the Great chose a new target, the Ottoman fortress at Azov. Victory here would grant Russia something that it dreamed of for centuries, a warm water port on the Black Sea. After a huge naval bombardment, the Ottoman troops surrendered and Russia took Azov. The Great Turkish War ended in 1699 when the Austrian army obliterated the Ottomans at the Battle of Zenta. Overall, the war had been a disaster for the Ottomans. They were forced to cede territory to the Austrian Habsburgs and recognize Russian control of Azov. However, the Ottomans would very soon win Azov back. As soon as Russia had made peace with the Ottomans, it found itself at war with Sweden in the Great Northern War. In 1708, Swedish King Charles XII invaded Russia with the hope of taking Moscow. His campaign was a disaster and the Swedish army was annihilated. Charles himself managed to escape to Ottoman-held Moldavia, which dragged the Ottomans into the conflict. Russia demanded that the Ottomans hand over the Swedish king, but the Sultan refused. Enraged, Peter the Great invaded, and that was a mistake. As his troops advanced, the Ottomans amassed an army almost 5 times the size of his, and before he knew it, he was surrounded. Realizing that he wasn't in a position to fight, the Russian Tsar was forced to sign the Treaty of Pruth, which gave Azov back to the Ottomans. This was a disaster for Tsar Peter. One of his greatest accomplishments had been lost. He was determined to win Azov back, but he would die before he had the chance. Retaking Azov remained a preoccupation for the Russian Tsars that followed, and it was in 1735 that the moment came to strike. 60,000 Russian troops marched into Ottoman territory and made good progress, taking Azov and parts of Crimea. Russia was forced to stop its invasion when its army was hit by bubonic plague. Neither side was able to make significant progress, and so negotiations began. At the Treaty of Nis, the Ottomans again ceded Azov. This time, they would never win it back. As the 18th century went on, it became increasingly clear that the Ottoman Empire was falling behind the rest of Europe in military and economic progress. The Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution propelled Western Europe to greater levels of wealth and technology, while the Ottoman Empire became increasingly corrupt and stale. Even so, reform was impossible. Many sultans wanted to make reforms, but they were blocked by the Islamic leaders or the elite military class known as the Janissaries. As the Ottoman Empire declined, so too did its neighbour to the north, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland had once been a powerful nation, but was now a Russian vassal. That caused huge resentment amongst the Poles, and in 1768 the Polish nobility rebelled against Moscow. The rebels wanted to re-establish the sovereignty of Poland and reduce Russia's influence. The rebellion failed and the nobles fled south into Ottoman territory. The Russian-backed forces followed the fleeing rebels across the border, and once in Ottoman territory they committed atrocities. The Ottoman Sultan was enraged and arrested the Russian ambassador in Constantinople. This was a declaration of war. Moscow responded by invading Moldavia and took several cities. In the Aegean Sea, Russian warships met an Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Chesma. The Russians used fire ships with devastating effect, and the Ottomans lost more than 20 vessels and 10,000 men. Losing on all fronts, the Ottomans were forced to the negotiating table and signed the Treaty of Cossack-Kainaka. The treaty gave Russia more influence in the Balkans, and the Ottomans were forced to give up Crimea, which was to become an independent state. This loss of Crimea was a huge blow to Ottoman pride, and the insult was about to get even worse. In 1783, just 9 years after Russia had signed the treaty recognizing Crimea as independent, it reneged and annexed Crimea. The Ottomans were powerless to stop this, but that didn't stop them trying. Once again, they declared war on Russia, demanding that they leave Crimea. Once again, they were militarily thrashed. Russia took several cities in Moldavia. Meanwhile, Austria entered the war and took Serbia. To make matters worse for the Ottomans, an uprising broke out in Greece, stretching their resources even further. Accepting defeat, the Ottomans signed the Treaty of Jassy in 1792 and recognized that Crimea was now part of Russia. By now, it was clear that Russia was militarily superior to the Ottoman Empire, and to have any chance in any future wars, the Ottomans would need to strike when Russia was particularly weak. Such a moment presented itself in 1805 when the Russian army was annihilated by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz. Sultan Selim III saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of the Russian defeat and depose the pro-Russian governors of Wallachia and Moldavia. In response, Russian forces invaded, and again the Ottomans were unable to hold them off. Selim III recognized the weakness of the Ottoman military and tried to implement modernizing reforms, but they were hugely unpopular. The Janissaries revolted against him and went on a murderous rampage through Constantinople. Sultan Selim himself was assassinated and replaced with his brother. On the front line, Russia continued to win battles and advanced south towards Constantinople. The final showdown would eventually take place at Slobozia on the Danube River. The two sides amassed their forces on either side of the river and assessed how to attack the enemy. The Russians decided that they would lure the Ottomans into a trap. They pretended to withdraw, inducing the Ottomans to cross the river in pursuit. Once half the Ottoman force had crossed the river, the Russian troops returned and surrounded them, and then began to bombard them with artillery. Trapped and running out of supplies, the Ottoman troops died not just from the artillery, but also from malnutrition and disease. For 6 weeks, the Russians bombarded the Ottomans until eventually they surrendered. With 36,000 casualties, the Ottomans couldn't continue fighting and came to the negotiating table. However, in the ensuing negotiations, Russia gained little. This was because it was about to get invaded by Napoleon, and so the Ottomans could press for lenient terms. With the conclusion of that war, the Ottoman Empire limped on, but was becoming ever weaker. In particular, its control of its Balkan colonies became more and more tenuous, and in 1821, Greece rebelled. The rebels were initially successful, but were gradually beaten back, and by 1826, almost all of Greece had been retaken. The rebellion might have been crushed had it not been for the entry of Russia, Britain and France on the side of the rebels. They smashed the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino, which left Constantinople vulnerable. On land, Russia advanced further than it ever had before and took the city of Adrianople, only 200 miles from Constantinople. With the situation perilous, the Ottomans entered into negotiations and were forced to make large concessions. Russia gained more territory in the Balkans, and Greece became an independent state. The Ottoman Empire was now so weak that it became merely a pawn in the plans of greater European nations. The debate regarding what should be done with the weak and unstable empire was known as the Eastern Question. The great powers were particularly concerned for the fate of Christians in the empire, and that would be the source of the next conflict. For almost a century, Russia had been the former protector of Christians within the Ottoman Empire, However, French Emperor Napoleon III wanted that title. Napoleon sent French warships into Ottoman waters, and the Sultan was intimidated into making him the protector of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Russian Tsar Nicholas I was determined that he would have the title and invaded Moldavia. Britain and France were opposed to Russia's invasion. They were nervous about how powerful Russia would become if it managed to take Constantinople. They issued Russia an ultimatum: withdraw your forces or we will enter the war on the side of the Ottomans. Nicholas I refused, and so Britain and France declared war on Russia. They landed troops in Crimea and defeated the Russians at the Battle of Alma. They then pushed south with the intention of taking the port city of Sevastopol. After a grueling siege that lasted almost a year, Sevastopol fell and Russia was forced to accept defeat. The new Russian Tsar Alexander II renounced his claim to be the protector of Christians and returned all territory that had been gained. Although formally on the side of the victors, the Ottomans were forced to significantly reduce their power over many Balkan states. The Ottoman Empire now had very little real control over those nations, and it was clear that they would soon win their formal independence. In 1875, the people of Herzegovina rose up against the Ottomans, and Serbia, Bulgaria and Montenegro soon joined them. The Sultan sent troops to quell the uprisings, but the ill-trained troops massacred thousands of civilians. Outraged by this atrocity, the European great powers called the Constantinople Conference, where they met with the Ottoman Sultan and demanded reforms. The Sultan rejected these demands, leading Russia to declare war in 1877. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops marched through Romania towards Constantinople. As the Russian army advanced south, the British became concerned that they would take Constantinople and so demanded a ceasefire. Russia ignored this, leading the British to send their navy to defend Constantinople. Russia was forced to stop its advance, and the great powers met at San Stefano to agree a peace deal. The Ottoman Empire lost almost all of its Balkan colonies. Montenegro, Serbia and Romania were given full independence, and a new Bulgarian state was created. The Ottoman and Russian empires would be enemies one more time during the First World War, a war which would destroy both empires. The Russian Empire suffered revolution in 1917 and the Tsarist regime was overthrown. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned by the victorious British and French who occupied Istanbul. It eventually fought its own war of independence to become the country of Turkey in 1923.